I'm the grandson of two residential school survivors. My grandfather, Maye'a, escaped from residential school so often they stopped forcing him to go. He never talked about his experience other than sharing with me how often he would get out of there. I reflect on this and I thank God that he was there protecting Maye'a in the time he spent getting home after escaping from residential school. A lot of Indigenous children that escape the horrors of residential school can't make that claim. My grandmother, my granny, has never shared her experiences of residential school other than the fact that she had never had it as rough as many other children that attended with her. My grandparents kept their Gitxsan identity and continued to practice our culture after they attended residential school. Not all residential school survivors can claim this. Although my grandparents kept their language and culture intact after surviving residential school, they didn't survive without any consequences to their well-being. Maye'a struggled with alcoholism for years before he was able to overcome his addiction. Maye'a was sober a few years before I was born and remained sober for the rest of his life. He shared with me that once he sobered up, he never touched a drink again. My granny sometimes calls herself a bad grandmother because she didn't teach us our native tongue, Gitxsanama, while we were growing up. I try to tell her that that's not her fault. If it wasn't for residential schools and their desire to exterminate our language and culture, I would most likely be speaking Gitxsanama with her all the time. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents before I can go to school. My mother is a teacher, so I would go to my grandparents' house from the ages of 0 to 4. My granny even looked after me at preschool. I got to go fishing with my grandparents on the coast. They took me hunting, berry picking, and other cultural practices such as our dances and our songs they taught. I'm learning my native language now. It has been a painfully slow process. I could speak it phonetically, but understanding the words themselves is still a struggle. I don't blame my grandparents for not teaching my mom, aunts, and uncles the intricacies of our language. They understand Gitxsanama, but it is hard for them to speak it. I'm actually really fortunate that I grew up in an alcohol-free home. There are many Indigenous people that cannot say the same. Residential schools have caused terrible trauma that many survivors didn't know how to cope with. And so a lot of survivors turn to drugs and alcohol to forget the trauma they had to endure. For a long time, the general public never knew about residential schools, so there were no or very little supports to help residential school survivors with their trauma. In my community, you can still see it, the trauma. We are still here, and we are still home, but there are wounds that need healing. There are scars, but as a people, when we are able to walk in who Creator God has made us to be in all its fullness, the healing will come. Hamia, Gabnism.